Welcome aboard the nautically themed podcast Into the Silentworld, where we'll be deep diving into a range of topics on the relationship of humans with the Earth's waterways and oceans.
So let's cast off and sail into our first season, where we'll be turning our telescopes onto the surreal and supernatural elements of our association with the sea.
And puns. Expect lots of puns, most of them bad.
I would like to think one or two of them would be a little bit punderful.
Oh.
I'm Kate.
And I'm Renee. We're part of Silent World Foundation, a small dedicated team exploring, supporting and promoting maritime archaeology, history, heritage and culture in Australasia. Our island home is Australia, and we come to you from good old Sydney town.
With Halloween just around the corner, we thought it would be the perfect time to delve into the seriously spooky, wonderfully weird and hair-raisingly horrific phantoms, myths, legends and superstitions from the watery depths of Australia and around our Pacific neighbourhood.
As we slowly glide on the ocean currents, and before we tackle the mayhem that will be this season, let's take a quick look at what this Halloween thing actually is and how it relates to the folks down under.
Halloween is celebrated every year on the 31st of October. Nowadays, it is made popular through American culture, mostly through the screen with TVs and movies, as being a holiday for costume-clad kiddies of all ages, weaving their way through the streets and pumpkin-lined gardens to homes to issue ultimatums to the occupants.
Give me a treat or else!
Or just trick or treat is the more traditional phrasing, but you do you.
Thank you.
Halloween actually has its origin in a much older culture and derives from the Celtic festival of, I'm going to attempt to say it, Samhain, which is from a Gaelic word and relates to being a fire festival, and specifically is a time to celebrate the harvest with bonfires and feasting, and marks the beginning of the Northern Hemisphere's descent into winter.
But we're in the Southern Hemisphere, so...
We shall circle back to that.
Okay. Yep.
It was also believed at this point of time the veil between the living world and the world of the spirits and other supernatural beings was thinner, and that therefore these supernatural and spiritual entities could cross into the human world and wreak havoc. So wearing a spooky costume confused the spirits and thus protected the wearer from their shenanigans. But how does this relate to Australia? It kind of doesn't.
Yeah, because we are currently in the midst of spring. Our flowers are blooming and filling the air with their fragrance, and the bees are back to doing their important work. The days are getting longer and warmer, and the hay fever sufferers are given some serious side eye by those around them, especially in these times of corona. Ooh.
And also, it's very hard to find a good pumpkin to carve at this time of year in Australia.
Yes, it's true. So while what Halloween represents does not quite jibe with the physical season in Australia, the holiday is still celebrated. All of these traditions and holidays came to Australia with the people, those who made their way over from Europe as migrants or as convicts. But how about the people who were already here? Those that lived in Australia for thousands of years before.
The Aboriginal people of Australia, also known as the Indigenous Peoples, or First Nations peoples, naturally developed an appropriate calendar, festivities, activities, observations and knowledge around each season. But there are many Aboriginal nations and groups, each living in a different region of this vast continent. So the seasons in the tropical north of the country play out a little bit differently than they do in the cooler south and everywhere in between.
Just consider this to get a better idea, right? If we overlay Australia on Europe, Australia's northern areas are actually in Norway, Sweden and Finland, while the southern areas are in the Mediterranean countries like Spain, Italy and Greece. Landscapes over this vast area range wildly as well. We have tropical forests, coastal areas, snowy capped mountains, and a red-hot desert in the middle.
In Australia, the simple spring, summer, autumn, winter system, imported from Europe doesn't quite apply because the seasons are not so clear-cut. Therefore, the calendars of the Indigenous people residing in different areas of this land were naturally, over 60,000 years, tailored to fit what was actually happening with the native flora and fauna. This was in fact much more precise, but it does mean some regions have 6 to 8 shorter seasons, rather than the European 4, and yet some other areas, like the tropical north, only actually have 3 distinct seasonal changes.
To give you an example of such a calendar, in Sydney, including Greater Sydney and surrounds, we're on the lands of a number of Aboriginal nations, including the Dharawal country. This country extends from South Sydney Harbour down the coast to Shoalhaven River. There are 6 seasons in the Dharawal calendar. The season over September and October, which is now, is the time of Nuningi, when it is still cool but getting warmer. It is largely characterised by the gathering of flying foxes.
Please, for those listening at home, can you explain what a flying fox is?
Yes. Although some listeners may already know, for those who don't and have no time to Google it at the moment, it is a largish bat with a furry body and a head like a fox. And they feed on fruit and do massive poos. And I mean massive. When one of those little parcels lands on the surface of a white car, it looks like someone got a can of black paint with seeds in it and just splashed it across the car. It's a mess. And although they do sound terrifying as far as appearances go, they are actually super cute and good for the environment as they seed the local flora. At dusk, swarms of them take flight and swirl in the skies over Sydney.
This is a season when the animals begin to stir and compete for territory and mates, so be careful of the magpies because they will attack you. Flower buds swell and begin to bloom, including our state floral emblem for those playing at home for New South Wales is the stunning and captivating bright red waratah flower. It is also a time when the traditional custodians of the land would gather for ceremonies to celebrate a time of plenty.
For the Dharawal people, it also marks a time when the restriction on consuming various types of crustaceans and mollusks is over. So many feasts would take place by the water's edge.
And it is at the water's edge where our investigation into the supernatural begins. Our first mysterious candidate up for discussion is the mythology and maybe in some cases reality of sea monsters.
Ooh, everybody loves a good sea monster sighting story.
Exactly. And we see this fascination with freaky creatures of the deep throughout history and well into the modern day. In fact, did you have a look at that Instagram I sent you of the Russian deep sea fisherman?
I did have a look at that Instagram, Kate, and now I have nightmares.
Happy Halloween.
Thanks. Yeah.
But on a serious note, we did actually draw some inspiration for this topic from our very own museum collection.
Yeah, the Silentworld Foundation Museum has a focus on the voyages of exploration for the Great Southern Land, early contact with Australian shores and peoples, and the colonial period up to the time of the last autocratic governor of New South Wales, Sir Lachlan Macquarie, who ended his term 200 years ago in 1821. Within our collection, we hold several prints and maps, some of which were produced in the 1500s and are home to several interesting sea beasts. The first of these we are looking at is a print of a map, which we'll call the Far East map.
Because it does have a Latin name, but our Latin pronunciation is a bit subpar.
Yeah. So I'm not going to attempt it. So this map was issued in Amsterdam. It dates to 1596 by...
Come on, you get points for trying this name.
Jan Hergen van Linschoten, a merchant and historian who served the Archbishop of Goa and accompanied him on his voyages to the Indian Ocean.
This map is a hand-coloured copper engraving of the Far East and Malay archipelago. The detail shown on it had never been shown on a printed map before and was known only to the Portuguese sailors. A curious feature of this map, at least to us common folk, is its orientation. We're used to seeing maps with the north being at the top of the page, but in this particular map, it's turned 90 degrees anti-clockwise, so in fact the top of the page points east. This position, however, would actually make sense to a ship's captain coming into the region from the west, trying to find his bearings. On the very edge of the right side of the map, which is actually the south, there is a small portion of a landmass labelled beach, the Oriferous Province. Oriferous in geology meaning gold, containing gold, or a gold bearing.
Look, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I find it kind of cool that people at some point in history refer to Australia, or at least part thereof, as beach. It kind of makes me feel like we're technically at the beach all the time, which is, I'm not going to lie, it's very comforting to think about, especially for those of us who observe the restrictions during this COVID lockdown.
You're not within 5 k's of a beach?
I'm not, sadly.
So what about the sea monsters? Where be the sea beasties?
Well, in this map, we find 5 creatures decorating the seas, with a couple of particularly large-looking specimens close to the beach, or Australia, which makes sense, as this part of the world wasn't mapped just yet. So it could well be home to the weird and wonderful, which actually, it turns out that it is.
Though not quite as weird and wonderful as that deep-sea fisherman Instagram.
No, that's very true. But the ones that we do see on the map are represented as light green in colour, with fishy yellow tails and fins, but with quite long curling bodies, described in some other works of the time as a leviathan.
Leviathan being a term used to describe any humongous sea monster in the past, which, given our modern understanding of the seas, probably applied mostly to sightings of dolphins, whales, and I would like to think a giant squid or two masquerading as a kraken.
Oh yes, I often get the sense that a kraken is watching when I'm diving.
It's not just the sea snakes that like to watch you when you go diving?
Not just the sea snakes. They actually quite friendly, apparently. A bit too friendly for my liking, but anyway.
They like your flippers.
They really do. I really must be careful. I must experiment with different coloured flippers. So, in addition to those 2 Leviathan specimens that we see on this map, there is depicted one normal-looking fish next to a ship in what is probably today's South China Sea, and another one in maybe the Indian Ocean. Look, the layout is a bit skew-with, so the association of land masses to one another is different to what we know it to be today. There is one more in the Pacific, close to some ships as well. Both the Indian and Pacific Ocean specimens actually have a double stream of water arching out of the top of their head, which makes us think that these are artistic representations of known animals at the time that possess a blowhole, like whales or dolphins. But the blowhole-bearing one in the Pacific has a dorsal-type fin that makes it look a bit like a dimetrodon. This fin looks like it's made up of a number of long spines connected with a membrane that makes it look a bit like a spiky hand fan. You know the ones that you can snap open, like, you know.
Ooh.
The only other prehistoric being that it kind of looks like is a Spinosaurus, which was actually an amphibian species. So, we find similar representations of these type of aquatic monsters in other 16th century works, suggesting that this is probably a fairly common artistic style of the time.
The other map print of interest today is also in the Silentworld Foundation collection and is one dating to 1646, and I have to say it is looking surprisingly accurate according to what we know the world to look like today. Bit better at the geography and cartography by then compared to the first map. Except of course for the area around Australia and the South Pacific, which is still shown as one big solid land mass with only a hint of the actual shape of Australia at the very edges. And again, we see the northernmost tip of this great southern land labelled as beach. This map is a hand-coloured copper engraving from Frankfurt publisher and engraver Matthias Murmerin, which I'm probably saying completely wrong, and is rather closely copied from a 1606 map. In this one, the sea beasties are coloured in green and red. We see 3 types of sea beasties close to the ship off the south coast of Africa, which looks like it has a long horn extending from its head, while another has a large head with 3 sharp spines poking out from its back. We see another sea beast that resembles a bird in flight with feathered wings and a beak, so it's a bit of a different variety, but still in the water just off the south coast of America. And the final sea beasties are spotted off the west coast of America. In this little grouping, one is shown close to a ship sprouting 2 streams of water from the top of its head, and another again is shown with a long coiled body and 2 short sharp fangs at the front of a long crocodilian snout, resembling the Leviathan types. So, question, apart from people learning how to draw land masses properly, why do sea monsters adorn these maps?
Well, in more ancient times, when certain areas of the world's surface were still very much a mystery, sea monsters were used to indicate danger. Unknown and uncharted waters could prove treacherous and even fatal.
So they were warning signs?
Yes, there'd be monsters here. But as time went by, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, more of the coasts and waters were mapped, yet the monsters still persist in some maps. Why? There are some studies and published works on this, but very simply and briefly put, although some explanations posit that they decorated maps were not meant for navigation and therefore could be made more interesting for display in the home of the owner by adding monsters, others think more on the evolution of the meaning of their presence. So instead of denoting unknown waters like they did before, they could be denoting locations where sea creatures were often sighted, or they could simply be added to signify the more exotic places of the world.
And some, although appearing fantastical, were in fact probably a genuine effort from the artists to provide a graphic description of what they understood a real-life sea creature to look like, based on what was proper research for their time from the sources available. Natural science was still catching up where ocean creatures were concerned, and some might say is still catching up. So sources from the time from which the artists drew their ideas were not all-encompassing.
And the rest probably came from accounts of those who spent most of their life riding the ocean waves.
A lot of the observations made at sea were by sailors, most of whom would have gone into their trade fairly early in life and perhaps were not formally educated. They described what they saw at sea as best they could with the knowledge they had.
Yeah, and they often compared what they saw in the waves to similar forms they knew of on land, and then tacked on any extra features. Therefore, the artist produced a land-looking animal that was kind of warped and strange-looking.
By the end of the 18th century and heading into the early 19th century, the world's oceans and coasts were better understood, and depictions of sea creatures on maps began to disappear, or take on more practical functions, such as denoting patches that were good for fishing. Although science was catching up and slowly dispelling the old myths, I would like to think that somewhere deep inside, we all still secretly believe that there is a Leviathan or a Kraken of mythical proportions cruising the deep blue sea and occasionally scaring the pants off people.
Yes, that would be amusing. Join us next time where we will dive even deeper into time itself to bring up stories of monsters in Pacific Indigenous mythology.
If you'd like to know more and keep up with our adventures, you can find us and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and look at our past and ongoing work with the Silent World Foundation website at silentworldfoundation.org.au. So until next time, keep your eyes peeled for any sea monsters you might run into. You've been listening to Kate
and Renee
from the Silent World Foundation. We hope you enjoyed our little dive into the depths of the sea, and keep listening for next time. Into the Silentworld is a Silent World Foundation production, hosted by Renee and Kate Pentecost. Thank you to the Mutineers, Sydney's leading pirate band, for performing and recording our hearty sailing theme songs, and during lockdown too. You can follow the band on their Facebook page, which we've linked to in the show notes on our website.
Thank you to our museum director, Paul Hundley, for his excellent suggestion to explore the sea monsters on the maps from the Silent World Foundation collection. If you want to find out more about any of the maps and other tales, and to see the sea beasties from this podcast, you can pop over to the episode notes.